My name is Caroline Reyes. I'm 35 years old, and 2 weeks ago, my mother stood on my porch for the first time in 6 years, wearing the same gray wool coat she wore to my wedding, holding a manila folder against her chest like it might protect her from something.
She didn't hug me.
She didn't ask about her grandchildren, who were inside finishing breakfast. She held up the folder and said, "We need to talk about what you owe this family." Here's what she didn't know when she said that. 10 years ago, my mother picked the man I would marry. Not introduced.
Picked.
And she never told me why, not while I was falling for him, not at our wedding, not at either of my children's baptisms. I found out the real reason 4 months ago, sitting at my own kitchen table at 11 at night, reading a letter my mother wrote in October of 2015 that she never imagined anyone but the man she sent it to would ever read. She came to my porch to collect on a debt. She had no idea I'd already read the paperwork. Quick thing before I keep going. If this is your first time here, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, because the rest of this story won't make much sense without what's coming. And if you've got a second, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the spring I turned 24. Before any of this, before I knew my own engagement had a price tag, nobody ever showed me. I grew up in Aldridge, Nebraska, a town of about 1,700 people, 40 minutes from the nearest movie theater, built around a grain elevator you could see from almost any front porch in town. We had one stoplight, one church, Trinity Lutheran brick, built in 1931, and a diner called the Wagon Wheel where the coffee was always a little burnt and nobody ever minded. My father, Walter Bishop, farmed 1,100 acres his own father had farmed before him. Corn, soybeans, a couple hundred head of cattle in years the markets made sense. He was up before 5 most mornings and rarely said more than he had to. My mother, Eleanor, ran the house, the church flower committee, and though nobody called it this out loud, the family's finances, with the kind of precision most people reserve for surgery. My younger brother, Derek, was 2 years behind me in school and exactly the kind of son a small town remembers fondly. Quarterback his junior and senior year. The kind of charm that got him out of speeding tickets from officers who'd known him since T-ball. My mother called him her future. She never called me that. I'll give you one specific memory because it explains more than I could in an hour of generalities. The spring I graduated high school, I was named valedictorian. I'd written a speech I was proud of, about the farm, about numbers, about how my father always said a field tells you the truth whether you want to hear it or not. The ceremony was a Thursday night. Derek's football banquet, not even a game, a banquet, a dinner with a slideshow, was the same Thursday night across town. My parents went to the banquet. My grandmother drove 40 minutes from Hastings to watch me give that speech alone in a folding chair near the back, because somebody from that family needed to be there, and it wasn't going to be the 2 people who'd raised me. I don't tell you that looking for sympathy. I tell you because the math matters later. In my family, attention was a limited resource, ration like diesel in a dry year, and it got allocated by some formula I never fully understood, except that Derek's tank always got filled first. I went to the University of Nebraska on a partial scholarship and worked 20 hours a week at a credit union to cover the rest. I finished my accounting degree in 3.5 years because I didn't want to pay for an extra semester, and I came home to Aldridge afterward, not because I dreamed of it, but because my father's longtime bookkeeper retired the same month I graduated, and my mother made it very clear that family money should stay in the family. I started doing the farm's books in the spring of 2015, the same season I turned 24, sitting at the same kitchen table where, 10 years and 1 letter later, I would lay a green ledger down next to my mother's handwriting and change everything. A year into keeping those books, in April of 2016, my father's tractor needed a part the Aldridge shop didn't stock. My mother told me to drive out to Reyes AG and implement the dealership 2 towns over, before they closed for the day. We'd never used that dealership before. We'd always gone local. I didn't think anything of it. The man behind the parts counter had grease on his forearms and a pencil behind one ear, and he didn't look up right away. When he did, he said, "Bishop, right? Your dad called ahead." That was Daniel Reyes. 26 years old, an agricultural engineering degree from Iowa State, working the counter at his father's dealership while he built something in his spare time he wouldn't fully explain to me for another 2 months, a soil moisture sensor that could text a farmer's phone before a field needed water instead of after. Which sounds simple now and sounded like science fiction in a county where half the irrigation pivots still ran on guesswork and a man's gut feeling. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing. I left without the part, because they were out of stock, and with his phone number, which I hadn't asked for. Looking back, I should have wondered why my mother sent me to a dealership we'd never used. I should have wondered why, 3 weeks later, she mentioned, almost in passing while doing dishes, that the Reyes family was hosting a customer appreciation dinner, and didn't I want to go, since I already knew that boy from the parts counter. I should have wondered why a woman who reused tin foil and clipped coupons for laundry detergent didn't blink, 18 months later, at the cost of a 5-tier wedding cake. I didn't wonder any of it. I was 24 and falling in love for the first time in my life, and the person doing the falling doesn't usually stop to audit the books. Daniel and I dated for 14 months. He proposed in June, kneeling on the gravel outside the dealership where we'd met, holding a ring he'd paid off in 3 installments because the prototype was eating most of his savings. I said yes before he finished the sentence. What should have surprised me more than it did was how thrilled my mother was. This was a woman who'd never once told me she was proud of something I'd done without finding a way to mention Derek's football season in the same breath. But when I told her Daniel had proposed, she cried real tears, the kind she didn't perform for an audience, and said, "This is good, Caroline. This is going to be so good for this family." Not for me. For this family. I noticed the wording. I just didn't understand it yet. Hold on to that sentence. We're coming back to it. We married that October at Trinity Lutheran. 200 guests, a band, an open bar my mother insisted on, even though my father grumbled about the cost for a month afterward. My dress had real lace sleeves, nothing I could have afforded on my own, and my mother paid the difference without me asking. Daniel's mother, Marisol, hugged me so hard at the rehearsal dinner, she knocked the wind clean out of me and told me I'd been missing from her family for 26 years, and she intended to make up for lost time. Daniel's father, Hector, a quiet, careful man who owned the dealership and shook my hand a beat too long the first time we met, gave a toast that night I now understand was carrying about 10 times the weight I thought it was at the time. "Some debts," he said, raising his glass, "get repaid in ways you don't expect." Everybody laughed. They assumed he meant something about raising sons, about the family business, about whatever fathers usually mean at weddings. I assumed the same thing. I was wrong, and so was every person in that reception hall, except for him and my mother. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Daniel and I lived 11 minutes from my parents' farm, in a rented house with a leaning porch and a kitchen too small for the table we'd inherited from his grandmother. I kept doing my father's books for free, the way I always had, on top of a full client load at a regional accounting firm in town. Daniel worked the parts counter by day and built his sensor company by night in a detached garage we filled with breadboards, a space heater, and a whiteboard he wrote on so much the marker never fully came off underneath. Our daughter, June, was born in the spring of 2019. My mother came to the hospital. She held June for exactly as long as it took someone to snap a photo for the church bulletin, then handed her back and asked me when I was coming to finish the quarter-end reconciliation because planting season didn't wait for anybody, not even for a new grandbaby. That same year, Derek was added to the farm's operating LLC as a 40% owner, on paper, despite never once opening the books I'd kept for 4 years. I found out from the paperwork itself, not from a conversation. When I asked my mother about it, she said, "He's going to be the one who carries this place forward, Caroline. You've got your own life now." I stood in that kitchen with June on my hip, doing the math in my head, for years of free bookkeeping, zero ownership, and said nothing, because that's what I'd always done. I was good at saying nothing. It would take me another 2 years to understand that my silence was the only currency that family had ever actually wanted from me. The real break came in the fall of 2020. Daniel's sensor company, he'd named it Field Sense by then, landed its first real customer, a 110-acre operation outside Grand Island willing to pilot the technology. It wasn't much. It was enough to make the decision we'd been circling for a year, Moved to Lincoln, where there was capital, engineering talent, and an actual chance at building something, instead of running it out of a garage 2 towns from nowhere. I told my mother over Sunday dinner. I remember the dish exactly. Her chicken and noodles, the kind she only made for company or bad news, sitting between us, going cold. She set her fork down very deliberately and said, "After everything I did to make sure the two of you ended up together, you're just going to leave." I didn't understand that sentence. Not really. I filed it away as one of her usual lines. My mother had a long history of acting like every good thing in my life was somehow her doing, and I didn't think about the specific phrasing again for almost 5 years. After everything I did. Not we've been through. Did. Past tense. Specific. A woman telling on herself in a sentence her own exhausted daughter was too tired to parse. What I understood clearly, even then, was the temperature in that house after we moved. Calls that used to come weekly stretched to monthly, then to almost never. A check I sent that Christmas, $300, meant for nothing in particular. Just an "I love you, here's a little extra," came back 4 weeks later in an envelope with no note, the check itself uncashed, my own handwriting staring out at me through the little plastic window. Derek's wedding, in 2021, came and went without an invitation. I found out the date from a registry a cousin mentioned at a funeral. My mother posted family Christmas photos every December. Herself, my father, Derek, his wife, eventually their kids, captioned "all my people" right here, and I was never in the frame, never asked to be. I started a folder that December. I told myself for a long time it was just habit, the same instinct that made me save every farm receipt since I was 16. But some part of me needed proof. Even then, that I wasn't imagining the silence. By the following spring, the folder had become an actual green columnar accounting ledger I bought at an office supply store because I liked the ruled lines, the way they forced every entry to have a date and an amount and a description, the way numbers don't lie even when people do. Entry 1, return check, $300, December 2020. Entry 2, Derek's wedding, no invitation, learned secondhand, June 2021. I didn't know yet how many entries that ledger would eventually hold. I just knew I needed somewhere to put the truth, because nobody in Aldridge seemed interested in saying it out loud. If you've ever been the one who did everything right in a family and still ended up outside the photo, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments below. I read every one, and I think you'll find you're far from alone in this. Lincoln, in those first couple of years, was not glamorous. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on a street that smelled like steam and chemicals every evening at 6. Daniel worked out of a co-working space that charged by the desk. I kept my accounting job remote and picked up 2 extra clients during tax season just to cover the 1-month field sense almost missed payroll. In February of 2022, when I transferred $11,000 out of our savings at 11 at night because Daniel couldn't quite bring himself to ask me directly. Our son, Theo, was born that same spring, almost 3 years after June. My mother did not come to the hospital. She sent a card to the apartment 3 weeks later, store-bought, generic, the kind with a stork on the front that could have gone to anyone, with no note inside except her signature. Entry 7. What I remember most about those years isn't the money, though I could tell you the exact balance of our checking account on any given month, because that's who I am. What I remember is Daniel falling asleep most nights with his laptop still open on his chest, and June learning to count using the sticky notes covered in equations stuck all over our refrigerator, and Marisol, Daniel's mother, driving 4 hours from Aldridge every 6 weeks without anybody asking her to, arriving with a trunk full of casseroles and an apron she kept in our hall closet because buying new ones felt like waste. She taught June to make her grandmother's tortillas standing on a kitchen chair. She sat in the waiting room for both of June's ear infections and every single school program for years afterward, and she never once mentioned my own mother's absence, not because she didn't notice, but because she was too kind to make me say it out loud. Hector helped differently, quietly. In 2022, he extended FieldSense a line of credit through the dealership that I now know was below market rate, dressed up as a standard vendor financing arrangement so Daniel wouldn't feel like he was taking charity from his own father. At the time, I thought it was generous. I didn't yet understand it was also, in its own way, a man trying to settle a different kind of account. Before we go further, if you've stuck with me this long, I'd guess the story is hitting somewhere close to home. Stick around. The part that changes everything is coming. FieldSense got its first real outside funding in late 2022, $800,000 from an agricultural venture fund out of Kansas City, enough to hire 4 engineers and move into an actual office, even if the sign on the door was just vinyl lettering Daniel applied himself on a Saturday afternoon. Growth, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was steady in a way that's almost boring to describe and impossible to fake. A second round in 2024, $6 million, let us expand the sensor network into 3 more states. By 2025, FieldSense had 40 employees and contracts covering close to 500,000 acres across 2 regional cooperatives. None of it made national news. A couple of agricultural trade outlets wrote it up. A regional business paper in Omaha ran a short profile with a photo of Daniel standing in a cornfield, holding one of our sensors like it was a baseball. I left the accounting firm in 2023 to run FieldSense finances full-time. My name went on the company paperwork next to his for the first time, co-founder, CFO, and it felt less like a promotion and more like something finally being made official on paper that had already been true in a garage for years. We bought a house that same year. Nothing extravagant, a 4-bedroom on a quiet street in southeast Lincoln, with a yard big enough for June's garden bed and Theo's soccer goal, a kitchen island where they did homework while I reviewed quarterly numbers on the other end. Nobody gave it to us. I remember signing the mortgage and thinking very clearly, this is the first room in my life nobody else gets to take credit for. It was the second funding round that started the noise back in Aldridge. $6 million is a real number, even diluted across investors, and somebody back home apparently reads agricultural trade newsletters because 3 weeks after the announcement, my old friend Hannah texted me. We'd gone to high school together. She still lived 2 streets from my parents and sat 3 pews back from them every Sunday. Random, she wrote. But your mom asked me after service what Series B meant. She wanted to know if it meant you were rich now. I didn't know what to say. My mother hadn't said my name out loud at church, according to Hannah, in over 3 years. She knew what a Series B was within a week of finding out it existed. A few months later, Daniel did a podcast interview for an AG Tech newsletter, dry and technical, mostly soil sensor calibration, the kind of thing that pulls maybe 600 listeners total. 4 days after it aired, Hannah texted again. Your mom told the whole sewing circle she'd always known Daniel had something special about him. Linda said she sounded proud. 6 years of silence, and suddenly she'd always known. I started noticing other things that spring. A handful of LinkedIn profile views from accounts with no photo, location listed simply as Aldridge, NE. A cousin's wife following our company page out of nowhere. And then, in March, Hannah sent me 7 screenshots she said she only had because Derek had accidentally added her old recycled number to a family group text meant for somebody else entirely. The thread had been running 3 days before anyone noticed Hannah was in it. I read all 7 screenshots sitting in the school pickup line outside June's elementary. Engine off, a stack of board materials still on the passenger seat from a meeting I'd left early to make it there on time. Derek, heard the company's worth like 60 mil now. Somebody check that. Eleanor, I've been tracking it. If they sell, it could be 3 or 4 times that. Eleanor, we need a plan before we just show up and ask. She's a numbers person. She'll respond to numbers. Derek, make mom a list, LOL. Eleanor, I'm making a list. Specific amounts. Frame it as investing in the family, not asking for a handout. Walter, I don't think we should be doing this. Eleanor, Walter. She has more money than this entire county. She can afford to help her own family. My father didn't reply after that. I sat there a long moment, watching kids file out of the building 1 grade at a time, June and Theo somewhere in that line, still too young to know anything had happened in a group chat 3 states away. I felt something I want to describe accurately because it wasn't rage. It was clarity. 6 years of silence, a return check, a wedding I wasn't invited to, a grandmother who'd seen her grandchildren maybe 4 times total, and the second the number got big enough, there was a plan. Not an apology. A plan. I drove home and made an entry that night. Entry 19, family group chat, financial reconnaissance, dated, screenshots attached. I want to tell you about the letter now because everything before this point, all of it, I understood wrong just by varying degrees. I thought my mother was cold. I thought she played favorites. I thought she was the kind of woman who'd come running the second money entered the picture, and on every one of those counts, I was right. What I didn't know is that she hadn't just neglected my marriage. She'd built it. It came out 4 months before my mother showed up on my porch, in a conversation I wasn't even part of at first. Daniel's grandfather, Hector's father, passed away that winter. A few weeks later, while clearing out an old filing cabinet in the back office of the dealership, the kind nobody had touched since the building was renovated in the 90s, Hector found a folder behind a drawer of expired warranty paperwork, water-stained at one corner, labeled in handwriting that wasn't his. He called Daniel into his office on a Sunday afternoon and didn't say much. He just slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a letter, handwritten, dated October the 14th, 2015, 6 months before I ever walked into that dealership for a tractor part. My mother's handwriting. Addressed to Hector. I'm not going to read you every word of it because some of it is mine to carry and not yours to hear secondhand. But I'll tell you what it said because I've read it more times than I can count since Daniel brought it home to me that night. The Bishop Farm owed Reyes AG and Implement just under $340,000, equipment financing going back nearly a decade, plus a balloon payment on 80 acres my grandfather had borrowed against in a bad year and never fully repaid. My mother knew the dealership was preparing to call the note. She wrote to Hector proposing what she called, in her own handwriting, a closer relationship between our families, restructured terms, an extended timeline, in exchange for what she described as goodwill she intended to build by encouraging, in her words, an introduction between Caroline and your son, who I understand is unattached. She mentioned that I kept the farm's books and had a good head for numbers. She wrote that she'd arranged for me to visit the dealership the following spring, once the new part-time bookkeeper position freed up my schedule, and asked Hector to make sure his son was the one working the counter that week. There was no part shortage in April of 2016. There was a letter written 6 months earlier that made sure I'd be standing in that dealership at exactly the right hour on exactly the right day. Daniel sat at our kitchen table the night he showed it to me and didn't say anything for a long time. I want to be honest about something. For about 4 minutes, I wasn't thinking about my mother at all. I was watching my husband's face, trying to figure out whether the last 10 years of his life had been a decision his father made for him, the same way I was about to ask myself the same question about mine. I don't think I was ever told to do anything, he said finally. I don't think Dad even told me to be nice to you. I think he just told me to work the counter that week.
He looked up at me.
I fell in love with you on my own. I need you to know that's true, whatever else turns out to be true. I believed him. I still believe him. That's the part my mother never accounted for in her careful handwriting. She could engineer a meeting. She could not engineer 14 months of late-night phone calls, or the way he learned exactly how I take my coffee, or the way he stood at a hospital window holding our daughter and cried for the first time I'd ever seen him cry. She bought a meeting. We built the rest of it ourselves, with a space heater and a whiteboard and nobody's money but our own. We sat out on the porch swing that night for almost 2 hours, not talking much, just sitting, the way you do when you both need the same kind of quiet. At some point, Daniel said, "My father gave that toast at our wedding. Some debts get repaid in ways you don't expect." He knew. He's known the whole time. I finally understood it too. Hector hadn't been joking about raising sons. He'd been confessing, out loud, in front of 200 people, in the only way he could find the nerve to. Somewhere in those 2 hours on the porch, 10 years of small, strange details rearranged themselves into a pattern I'd never let myself see. The dealership we'd never used before. The tears that came a little too easily when Daniel proposed. Asterisk, this is good, Caroline. This is going to be so good for this family. Asterisk, my mother hadn't married me off. Not technically, not in the way the old stories use that phrase. She'd done something colder and smarter than that. She'd built the conditions for it and then stepped back and let 2 20-something kids fall in love on schedule and called it fate for 10 years, right up until the week her daughter's company got valuable enough to make the whole arrangement worth bragging about. I photocopied the letter twice. One copy went into a safe deposit box. The other went into the ledger behind entry 19 in a sleeve I labeled simply, "The Reason." 4 months after that, FieldSense was acquired by an agricultural holding company out of Minneapolis for $212 million. Daniel and I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in a glass conference room overlooking the river. We didn't celebrate with anything bigger than takeout pho and a bottle of wine we'd been saving for 4 years, because by then, neither of us much felt like throwing a party. A regional business paper ran a short piece 2 days later. It used the word homegrown. It mentioned Lincoln. And it mentioned, in exactly one sentence, that company co-founder and CFO Caroline Reyes grew up on a family farm in central Nebraska. That sentence, as far as I can tell, is the only reason my mother knew exactly how much money had landed in my life, and exactly when. 2 weeks after it ran, she showed up on my porch. "This is the part you've been waiting for. Stay with me." She'd taken a bus from Grand Island, the nearest station, because, I learned later, my father wouldn't drive her. The first real act of resistance I'd ever known him to make. She wore the gray coat for my wedding even though it was 81 degrees out. She held the manila folder against her chest, and when I opened the door, she said, "We need to talk about what you owe this family," and I said, "Come in," and led her to the kitchen, not the living room, because the kitchen is where the truth lives in my house, the same way it apparently had in hers. She sat at the table. I poured 2 glasses of water. "No coffee. Coffee is for people who are staying." She unfolded the paper from the folder. 5 lines, her handwriting, the kind of careful penmanship that comes from a draft, not a first attempt. Farm equipment payoff, $180,000. Down payment on the Hendricks parcel for Derek's expansion, $250,000. Your father's hip surgery and recovery, $60,000. College fund for Derek's 2 kids, $190,000. Family support, monthly, ongoing, not specified. $680,000 on the page, not counting whatever she meant by ongoing. "This is what family does, Caroline," she said, sliding it across the table. "Your father worked that land his whole life. You owe this family a foundation." I didn't answer right away. I got up, walked down the hall to my office, and came back with the green ledger I'd carried out of an office supply store 5 years earlier, without any idea what it would eventually hold. I set it down next to her list. Hers, 1 page, 5 lines, $680,000. Mine, 19 entries, 6 years, and a letter dated October the 14th, 2015. "You brought a list," I said. I brought one too. I didn't yell. I read it the way I read a quarterly report to a board, flat, factual, item by item. The return check. Derek's wedding. The store-bought card with no note after Theo was born. The Christmas photos captioned all my people, 19 entries, dated, one at a time, while my mother's face moved through every stage I'd watched it move through my entire childhood. Wounded, defensive, the practiced tears that arrived right on cue and never quite reached her eyes. "I was hurt," she said. "You left. You took my grandchildren, and you left. You told me, at that Sunday dinner, that I was leaving after everything you did to make sure Daniel and I ended up together." I kept my voice level. "I didn't understand that sentence for 5 years, Mom. I understand it now." She went very still. I slid the photocopied letter across the table last, after everything else, the way you save the one piece of evidence that actually closes a case. October 14th, 2015. Her handwriting. $340,000. An introduction between Caroline and your son. She looked at it a long time before she spoke. "I was trying to save this family," she finally said. "The bank was going to call that note, Caroline. We would have lost the West 80. I did what a mother does. I found a way." "You didn't find a way," I said. "You found me a husband to pay off a tractor loan, and then you spent 10 years acting like it was destiny, and then you spent 6 years punishing me for building a life you didn't engineer." I closed the ledger. The rings clicked shut. "You told Linda, at the sewing circle, you'd always known Daniel had something special about him. You didn't tell her you'd known it before I ever met him because you're the one who decided he would. She didn't have an answer for that. I watched her search for one anyway. I'd watched that search my entire childhood, the scramble through old leverage, old guilt, old scripture, and find nothing that fit. What will people at church think? She tried, quieter now. If they find out you turned your back on your own parents. They already know I exist again, Mom. You made sure of that the day you found out what Series B meant. I didn't raise my voice. I'm not worried about the sewing circle. I'm worried about whether you've ever once, in 10 years, told anybody the truth about why I'm married to the man I'm married to. The garage door rumbled open. Daniel came in from picking up the kids, saw his mother-in-law at the table, saw the ledger, saw my face, and didn't say a word. He set his keys on the counter, walked over and put his hand on my shoulder. That was all. No speech. Just a man standing exactly where he'd always stood. My mother looked at his hand on my shoulder for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I will not give you that money, I told her. Not because I can't. Because the second I do, you'll tell yourself and tell Derek and tell the sewing circle that this was always just a family being a family. It wasn't 6 years of silence. It wasn't a letter you wrote about my husband like he was a line item. I won't let you buy that story, Mom. Not with my money, and not with your own. I pushed her list back across the table. If you ever want to actually know your grandchildren, not as people you missed in 2019 and 2021 and 2022, but as people, that starts with an apology, someday, when they're old enough to understand it. Not to me. And it doesn't start with a number. She picked up her list. She picked up her suitcase. She stood at the door for a moment like she might say something else, and then she didn't, and the door clicked shut behind her. Not a slam, just a quiet, final click, the sound of someone walking away from something she could no longer buy back. My father called 11 days later, on a Wednesday morning, while I was reviewing a vendor contract at the kitchen table. His voice was thinner than I remembered. Your mother told me what happened, he said. She didn't tell me everything. I had to call Hector myself before I believed the rest of it. A long pause. I didn't know about the letter, Caroline. I want you to hear that from me directly. I knew we needed the dealership to work with us on that note. I never knew what your mother offered them to make it happen. I believed him. My father had always been the one who went quiet instead of the one who schemed, an enforcer of other people's plans, never the architect of his own. And for the first time, I understood that as its own kind of failure rather than innocence. He hadn't built the trap. He just never asked enough questions about why it worked so well. I should have called you every one of those 6 years, he said. I told myself your mother needed time. I have no idea what I thought that meant anymore. I'm sorry, baby girl. Not for the money. I don't want anything from you. I want to know my grandkids if you'll let me try. We can start slow, I told him. Phone calls. No visits yet. Let's see what slow looks like first. That's more than I deserve. It's exactly what you deserve, I said. Not more. Not less. Derek texted twice that month. The first was 3 words. You could have helped. The second, a week later after I didn't answer the first. Must be nice. I didn't reply to either one. Some messages answer themselves. Hector drove out to Lincoln in July, alone, and sat with Daniel in our backyard for almost 2 hours while I kept the kids occupied inside. I don't know everything they said to each other, and I haven't asked for all of it because some conversations belong to the people having them. What I do know is that Hector cried, which Daniel told me he'd never once seen before, and that he said some version of the same sentence 3 different times. I should have told you the day I found that letter, not the day my own father died, and forced my hand. Daniel forgave him faster than I expected. I think it helped that Hector had spent 10 years quietly trying to make it right in the only language he knew. A line of credit at a fair rate. A wedding toast nobody understood. 1,000 small kindnesses that were never quite an apology, but were never nothing either. My mother has not called, has not texted. The silence has come back around, except this time. It's hers to end, not mine to interpret. The ledger is back in the bottom drawer of my desk, behind the kids' old report cards and a stack of expired passports. 19 entries. 1 letter. I haven't added a 20th. I hope I never need to. Here's what I've come to understand, sitting with all of this for 4 months now. My mother didn't marry me off in the way the old stories use that phrase. Nobody forced me down an aisle. I chose Daniel Reyes with my whole heart, every single day for 10 years, and I'd choose him again with that letter sitting right there on the table between us. That part was never a lie. Even if the beginning of it was a transaction I never agreed to and never knew I was part of. But here's what she never accounted for. In all that careful handwriting, all that patient waiting for the math to work out in her favor. You can engineer an introduction. You cannot engineer whether two people, once they know the whole truth, decide they'd still choose each other anyway. That part has never once shown up in anybody's ledger. It never will. My mother thought she was owed something because, 10 years ago, she made a calculation that happened to work out. What she never understood is that the marriage isn't what she's owed credit for. We are. Daniel and I, and the company we built with a space heater and a whiteboard and nobody's money but our own, and 2 kids who've never once gone without a grandmother, because Marisol showed up every 6 weeks for 10 years without anybody asking her to. Family, I've learned, isn't the people who engineer your life from a distance and show up once it pays off. It's the people who show up when the garage is cold and the prototype keeps crashing and there's no number on the table yet worth anybody's trip. If you found out that the biggest, most defining decision of your life had started as someone else's financial calculation, would it change how you feel about the choice itself, or just about the person who made it for you without ever asking? I'd genuinely like to know where you land on that. Tell me in the comments. And if this one hits somewhere real, share it with somebody who needs to hear that their worth was never something anyone else got to calculate for them. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. You inherited weeds. I guess congratulations. I remember looking toward the parking lot. Rainwater was dripping off the maple trees. I could hear traffic from Main Street. Then I answered. I think Grandpa gave me exactly what he wanted me to have. She shrugged. Have fun playing farmer. Then she climbed into Mom's SUV and drove away. At the time, it sounded like a joke. It wasn't. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next month, Daniel and I spent nearly every weekend restoring the property. Broken fencing, rotting planter boxes, old irrigation lines. The greenhouse roof leaked in 3 places. There was more work than 2 people could realistically finish. So I called Madison. Not because I expected miracles, just because Grandpa had loved both of us. I thought maybe she'd want one weekend helping preserve something he'd spent 40 years building. She answered on the second ring. I can't. Agency booked me for a swimwear campaign. I said I understood. Then she added something I never forgot. Besides, why would I waste a Saturday pulling weeds? I've got a future. The line went quiet. I wished her luck, hung up, and wrote the date on my calendar. Not because I was angry, because something about that conversation felt important. I just didn't know why yet. For the next several weeks, life settled into a routine that looked ordinary from the outside. Monday through Friday, I designed outdoor spaces for clients across central Kentucky.
Some wanted stone patios.
Others wanted native wildflower gardens or backyard ponds. I enjoyed the work because every project had a beginning, a middle, and an end. If something wasn't growing, there was usually a reason. Bad soil. Too much shade. Not enough water. Plants made sense. People rarely did. Every Saturday morning, Daniel and I drove to Grandpa Walter's property before sunrise. We always stopped at the same gas station for coffee. Mine was black. Daniel added exactly 2 packets of sugar every single time. By 6:30, we'd unlock the old gate and start working. The place had been neglected during Grandpa's final illness. Weeds stretched between the raised beds. The orchard hadn't been pruned in almost 2 years. The irrigation pump groaned every time it started. None of it discouraged me. I actually liked seeing progress happen a little at a time. You can't rush a garden. Trying only makes things worse. One Saturday, while replacing broken cedar boards around the vegetable beds, Daniel looked toward the greenhouse. You know, he said, your sister still hasn't come out here once. I shrugged. She's busy. He hammered another nail before answering. Busy isn't the same thing as unwilling. I didn't reply, because deep down I knew he was right. Mom visited exactly one time that summer. She wore white sneakers that somehow stayed perfectly clean despite walking across muddy ground. She looked around for maybe 15 minutes. "I don't understand why you're putting so much money into this place," she said. I explained that most of the lumber had been discounted and that Daniel and I were doing almost all the labor ourselves. She nodded politely. Then she asked, "So, when are you planning to sell it?" I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "You could probably get a decent price," she continued. "Land values around here are climbing." I looked toward Grandpa's greenhouse. I promised him I'd keep it. Mom sighed the way parents do when they think you're making a childish decision. "Emily, promises don't pay mortgages." "No," I said quietly, "but they help me sleep." She didn't stay much longer. Madison, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere. Instagram, Facebook, local fashion magazines. Every few weeks, Mom would text family photos from another modeling event. Fashion Week in Nashville, a cosmetics campaign in Cincinnati, a luxury boutique opening in Louisville. Every picture looked perfect. Perfect lighting, perfect makeup, perfect smile. I always clicked the little heart. She was my sister. I genuinely wanted her to succeed. I just wished she could be happy for me, too. Late that August, I invited the whole family to the property for a small Sunday lunch. Nothing fancy. Pulled pork sandwiches, fresh corn, tomatoes from Grandpa's garden, peach cobbler. Dad accepted immediately. Mom said she'd try. Madison answered with one sentence. "I have a casting call." I later found out through social media that the casting call had apparently happened at a rooftop brunch with several influencers. Again, I didn't say anything. Instead, I wrote another date in my planner. Not because I was keeping score, because I had started noticing a pattern. Whenever family required effort, Madison disappeared. Whenever cameras appeared,
so did she.
By October, something unexpected happened. The first harvest from Grandpa's restored gardens exceeded every expectation I had. Tomatoes,
Squash,
peppers, pumpkins, green beans. Enough produce that Daniel joked we'd accidentally started a grocery store. We donated boxes every Thursday to a local food pantry. The director called me personally after the second delivery. "You have no idea how many families this helps." Actually, I did. Grandpa used to tell me every vegetable had two jobs. Feed your family. Feed somebody else's if you can. I finally understood what he meant. One afternoon, while loading produce into my truck, a local newspaper photographer stopped by. She was writing a feature about community gardens. She took a few pictures, asked simple questions. How long had I been gardening? Why did I donate so much? What inspired the project? I talked about Grandpa, about the greenhouse, about teaching kids where food actually comes from. The article came out the following Sunday. Half a page. Nothing dramatic. I barely thought about it after reading it once. But someone else noticed. That Tuesday, Mom called. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to congratulate me. Her first question was, "Did you know your picture was in the paper?" "Yes." Madison said several people from her agency saw it online. I waited. Mom continued. "She's worried people might think she's, well." She hesitated. Less successful. I blinked. "I'm holding zucchini, Mom." "I know, but your story is getting attention." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked, "What exactly is the problem?"
"There isn't one."
Then she quickly changed the subject. But something about that conversation stayed with me. Success doesn't always threaten strangers. Sometimes, it threatens people who thought they were supposed to be the successful one. Around Thanksgiving, Daniel had an idea. "What if we host gardening workshops next spring?" I laughed. For who? For anyone. Families. Retirees. Kids. People who have no idea where tomatoes come from. The idea sounded almost too simple. We printed 20 flyers.
Posted them around town.
Expected maybe 5 people. The first workshop filled in 48 hours. Then another. Then another. Soon, every Saturday afternoon through June was booked. We charged almost nothing. Just enough to cover materials. People didn't come because it was cheap. They came because they wanted to learn. And because Grandpa's old greenhouse somehow made everyone feel welcome, Dad started visiting more often. Not every week. Maybe once a month. He never talked much. Mostly he'd trim branches or repair fencing beside me. One afternoon, he quietly said, "You know, your grandfather would have liked this." I smiled. "I hope so." He nodded once. "I think he would have been proud." It wasn't an emotional conversation. Dad wasn't emotional. But hearing those words meant more than he probably realized. Madison never came. Not once. Even after Dad invited her himself. According to Mom, she was simply too busy building her career. I accepted that explanation until Christmas Eve. That's when everything changed. We gathered at my parents' house like we always did.
Turkey.
Mashed potatoes. Football on television. The same traditions we'd followed for years. Halfway through dinner, Dad asked Madison if she'd seen the greenhouse since Grandpa passed. She smiled politely.
No.
Then she looked directly at me. "I honestly don't understand why Emily keeps wasting her weekends out there." The room went quiet. She wasn't finished. Imagine inheriting 6 acres and deciding vegetables were your biggest ambition. Mom chuckled softly. Dad looked down at his plate. I set my fork down. "I don't think feeding people is wasting time." Madison smiled again. The same smile outside the attorney's office. "You always say things like that. As if gardening changes the world." I looked at her calmly. "It changed Grandpa's." She rolled her eyes. "No offense, but I'd rather be on a magazine cover than standing in mud." Nobody spoke after that. Dinner continued. But something shifted. Not loudly. Quietly. The kind of shift you only recognize months later. Because that Christmas was the last holiday before life started proving that not every seed grows immediately. Some take years. And some people don't realize what's been growing until it's far too late. Christmas came and went. Life returned to normal. At least it looked that way. By January, the greenhouse had become part of my weekly routine in the same way brushing my teeth or paying bills had. Every Tuesday evening after work, I drive out to the property with a notebook Grandpa had used for nearly 20 years. It wasn't fancy. Just a faded black composition book with weather notes, planting dates, fertilizer schedules, and little comments scribbled in the margins. "Too much rain this week. Tomatoes sweeter after cool nights. Don't rush asparagus." He never wrote long paragraphs. Just observations. Looking through those pages felt less like reading instructions and more like having another conversation with him. One cold evening, Daniel found me sitting at the greenhouse workbench reading through it. "You've read that notebook 100 times. "I know. So, what are you looking for?" I smiled. "I'm not looking. I'm remembering. That winter, I decided to do something Grandpa had always talked about but never had the time to finish. A cut flower garden. Not because flowers made more money, because they made people stop. Vegetables fed the body. Flowers fed something harder to explain. I spent weeks researching varieties that would grow well in Kentucky. Zinnias, snapdragons, cosmos, dahlias, sunflowers. Nothing exotic. Just dependable flowers that could survive unpredictable weather. The seeds arrived in plain brown envelopes. I spread them across the kitchen table one Saturday morning. Daniel picked one up. "That's a lot of flowers." "It is." "You nervous?" "A little." "What if nobody buys them?" I laughed. "Then the bees will." By early March, tiny green shoots began appearing inside the greenhouse. Rows so straight they almost looked printed. Every morning before work, I'd check on them. Some mornings they looked exactly the same. Other mornings they'd somehow doubled overnight. Gardens have a way of rewarding patience. People usually don't. Around that same time, Madison's modeling career seemed to be accelerating. Mom talked about it constantly. Madison's doing a campaign in Chicago. Madison's agency wants her in Miami. Madison met someone from New York Fashion Week. Every phone call eventually became about Madison. She never asked how the greenhouse was doing. Never asked about the workshops. Never asked whether donations to the food pantry were still growing. Eventually, I stopped expecting her to. In April, something happened that none of us planned. A popular gardening influencer from Tennessee happened to stop by one of our Saturday workshops while visiting family nearby. I didn't even recognize her. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, bought a small bouquet, thanked everyone. That was it. 3 days later, she posted a video online. It wasn't flashy. Just clips of families planting vegetables, children laughing with dirty hands, and Grandpa's greenhouse glowing in the evening sun. By the end of the week, more than 2 million people had watched it. I only realized something unusual had happened because my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Workshop registrations exploded. Local schools started calling. Church groups wanted tours. Community colleges wanted guest lectures. Even nearby restaurants asked whether we'd sell fresh produce directly to them. Daniel looked at the calendar and laughed. I think we're going to need a bigger parking lot. The attention was exciting, but it also created problems. The old gravel driveway couldn't handle dozens of vehicles every weekend. The greenhouse needed new ventilation. We needed insurance updates, portable restrooms, more volunteers. I spent evenings filling out paperwork instead of watching television. Success, I learned, creates its own workload. Dad noticed before anyone else. One Saturday morning, he arrived carrying a toolbox. I figured you might need another pair of hands. I smiled. I always do. For the next 6 hours, we repaired fences together. We barely talked. Dad wasn't the type. But before leaving, he looked around at the families walking through the gardens. Kids carrying watering cans. Parents taking pictures. Older couples buying flower bouquets. You built something special here. I shook my head. Grandpa did. Dad looked at me.
No.
He started it. You kept it alive. Those words stayed with me. Mom finally visited again in late May. Only this time, she brought Madison. I hadn't seen my sister in almost 5 months. She stepped out of a white luxury SUV, wearing designer boots that definitely weren't made for gravel roads. Large sunglasses. Perfect hair. Perfect makeup. She looked around slowly. There are a lot of people. There usually are on Saturdays. She nodded. I saw your video. I smiled. It wasn't really my video. You know what I mean. For nearly 20 minutes, she wandered through the flower field without saying much. People occasionally recognized her from regional advertisements. They asked politely for selfies. She happily obliged. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, walked past Madison without recognizing her at all. Instead, she ran straight toward me, holding a tiny sunflower. Miss Emily, look, it bloomed. Her mother followed behind, smiling. We planted this here last month. I think she's more excited than we are. The little girl hugged me before running back toward the greenhouse. Madison watched the whole thing. Her smile faded just slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. Recognition is strange. Some people chase it through cameras. Others earn it quietly. Only one of those usually lasts. As Mom prepared to leave, she stood beside her SUV and looked back toward the garden. You know, this place is getting surprisingly popular. I nodded. It seems that way. You could probably charge more. We're doing okay. She hesitated. Madison mentioned something. I waited. Maybe you could hire her to promote the farm online. I blinked. The farm? You know, social media, photography, brand partnerships. I looked toward Madison, who was checking notifications on her phone, then back at Mom. I appreciate the idea, but we're growing slowly on purpose. Mom seemed disappointed. You should think bigger. I smiled politely. I am, just not in the same direction. That summer became the busiest season of my life. Schools booked field trips months in advance. The flower garden sold out almost every weekend. Restaurants placed standing orders. Our donation program doubled. Daniel eventually reduced his engineering hours to help full-time on weekends. Neither of us expected any of it. We just kept solving one problem at a time. New greenhouse fans. Additional raised beds. A larger irrigation system. Another volunteer coordinator. Every improvement came from revenue we'd actually earned. No loans. No investors. No shortcuts. Grandpa would have liked that. Meanwhile, Madison's social media became increasingly polished. Luxury hotels, fashion events, private parties, designer handbags. Everything looked glamorous. But I started noticing something else. The same brands stopped appearing after a while. New agencies replaced old ones. Different photographers every month. The captions became more promotional, more sponsored, more carefully written. I didn't think much about it.
People change jobs all the time.
Still, something about it felt less stable than it looked. One evening, while Daniel and I were washing harvest baskets, he asked, "Have you noticed your sister watches every single story you post now?" I laughed. I doubt she's actually interested in gardening. Maybe. He rinsed another basket. Or maybe she's finally paying attention. I shrugged. If she ever wants to visit, she's welcome. He smiled. That's one of the things I admire most about you. What? You never close the gate. I looked out toward the greenhouse where volunteers were finishing cleanup.
No.
I just don't force anyone to walk through it. At the time, I thought the hardest part of the story was behind us. I was wrong. Because before the summer ended, Madison was going to make a decision that would change everything between us. And unlike the first time, this one would happen in front of our entire family. By the middle of August, our weekends barely resembled weekends anymore. The property opened to visitors every Saturday at 9. Daniel unlocked the front gate. I usually walked through the flower fields before anyone arrived, coffee in one hand, a clipboard in the other. Not because I enjoyed paperwork. Because Grandpa had taught me something simple. If you notice little problems early, they never become big ones. Broken irrigation hose?
Fix it today.
Loose fence post? Don't wait until it falls. Rotting tomatoes? Pick them before they spoil the others. It turned out that lesson worked for businesses too. One Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing workshop registrations, I received a call from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. At first, I assumed I'd forgotten to submit some paperwork. Instead, the woman on the phone said something I never expected. "We'd like to feature your educational garden during our fall community agriculture tour." I honestly thought she had the wrong number. Our garden? Yes. "We've been following your education program and your donation partnership with local food banks. We think it's exactly the kind of project Kentucky should be highlighting." After I hung up, I just sat there staring at my desk. Daniel walked into the office, carrying a box of seed catalogs. "You look like somebody just told you the lottery numbers." I laughed. Not quite. Then I handed him the email confirmation. He read it twice, then smiled. "I wish Walter could see this." So, do I. Preparation for the tour took almost 6 weeks. Fresh mulch, new signs, additional benches. Volunteers repainted the greenhouse. A retired carpenter from town built children's planting tables without charging us $1. When I tried to pay him anyway, he shook his head. "My wife learned to garden here before she passed. Let me do this." Moments like that reminded me that Grandpa hadn't just grown vegetables. He had quietly built relationships. Dad started showing up almost every Saturday, sometimes before Daniel and I even arrived. I'd find him tightening fence wire or sweeping the greenhouse walkway. He never announced himself. He just worked. One morning I thanked him. He shrugged. "It keeps me busy." A few minutes later he added, "And your grandfather would have expected me to help." It wasn't an apology for all the years he'd ignored the garden, but it felt like something close. Mom, on the other hand, became oddly interested. Not in gardening, in attendance numbers. "How many visitors did you have last weekend? What are you charging now? Do people really drive 2 hours just to buy flowers?" The questions came almost every phone call. I answered politely, but I noticed she never asked whether I was tired or happy, only whether the place was growing. Then, about 2 weeks before the agriculture tour, Madison called. Not texted. Called. That alone caught my attention. "Hey, It had been months since she'd used that nickname. "Hi. I was thinking, maybe I could come help during the event." I smiled. "I'd love that." There was a short pause. Then she said, "I was actually thinking more about representing the brand." "The brand?"
Yeah.
I mean, she laughed softly. You've built something that's getting attention. I know marketing. I know photography. I've worked with brands for years. I could help make this bigger. I looked around the office. There wasn't a brand. There was a greenhouse, a vegetable garden, some flowers, a lot of volunteers, and a notebook full of Grandpa's handwriting. Still, she was my sister. So I said, if you want to volunteer, absolutely. We'll probably be moving tables, unloading pumpkins, helping visitors. She interrupted. Oh, I wasn't really talking about manual work. I meant media. The conversation lasted another 5 minutes. By the time we hung up, I understood something I hadn't before. Madison didn't want to help grow the garden. She wanted to be seen standing beside it. There was a difference. The agriculture tour arrived on a cool Saturday morning in September. By 8 o'clock, cars were already lined up outside the gate. School buses, families, retirees, master gardeners, local reporters, even a regional television crew. Daniel looked toward the entrance and quietly said, I think we underestimated today. We definitely had. By noon, more than 700 visitors had walked through the property. Children planted lettuce. Grandparents shared gardening stories. Teachers took notes. Volunteers barely stopped moving. I didn't sit down once. Neither did Daniel. It was exhausting. And wonderful. Around 1:30 that afternoon, a black SUV pulled into the parking area. Mom stepped out first. Dad followed. Then Madison. She looked exactly the way she always did. Designer sunglasses. Perfect makeup. Cream-colored dress. High-heeled boots. The kind of outfit you'd wear to a fashion launch. Not a working farm. Several visitors immediately recognized her. She smiled. Waved. Posed for photographs. Meanwhile, 2 volunteers were struggling to unload 50-pound bags of compost. Dad quietly walked over and helped them. Mom found a shaded chair. Madison remained near the entrance, greeting people. About 20 minutes later, Daniel came looking for me. You might want to see this. What happened? He pointed toward the sunflower field. Madison had positioned herself between 2 flower rows while a photographer she apparently brought herself took dozens of pictures. Different angles, different poses. Hat on, hat off, basket in hand, looking over her shoulder, touching flowers she'd never planted. Visitors had started waiting because the pathway was blocked. I walked over. Madison. She turned, smiling. Oh, Emily. Isn't this beautiful? It is. But people need to get through. Will just be another minute. I looked behind her. A line of families stretched almost 30 feet. Children holding watering cans. An elderly couple waiting patiently. I smiled politely. We really need to keep the path clear. She sighed dramatically. Fine. As she walked away, I heard her tell the photographer. We'll find better lighting later. I didn't think much of it. Until that evening. After everyone left. After we'd cleaned up. After Daniel and I collapsed onto the porch with cold lemonade. My phone started buzzing. Again. And again. And again. Friends. Volunteers. Neighbors. They all sent me the same thing. Madison had already uploaded a video. The caption read, "So proud of everything we built together. Excited for what's next." I watched the video twice. Every clip featured Madison, walking through flower fields, holding baskets, greeting visitors, smiling at children. Anyone watching would assume she'd spent months helping create the place. Not once did the video show volunteers. Daniel, Dad repairing fences, or the thousands of hours spent restoring Grandpa's property. It looked like a professional campaign, not a family garden. I set my phone down without saying anything.
Daniel looked at me.
You okay? I think so. You don't sound convinced. I took a sip of lemonade before answering. She chose modeling over helping. But now that people are paying attention, she wants people to think she built it. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Grandpa's greenhouse glowing softly in the evening light. Finally, he said, "You've never cared who gets credit." I don't. So, what's bothering you? I thought about it for a long moment. Then I quietly replied, "It's not about credit, it's about truth." That night, before going to bed, I opened a folder on my computer. Inside were hundreds of photos. Every stage of the restoration. Broken fencing, collapsed greenhouse panels, mud-covered weekends, volunteer sign-in sheets, receipts, donation records, pictures Grandpa had taken years earlier. I wasn't building evidence against Madison. I simply believed memories deserved dates. Grandpa always wrote everything down. Maybe I'd inherited that habit. At the time, I had no idea those records would eventually become the one thing my sister could never explain away. Because less than 3 months later, the career she'd chosen over helping our family would begin falling apart. And for the first time in her life, she was going to need the very sister she'd spent years looking down on. October arrived with the kind of mornings Grandpa used to love. Cool enough for a flannel jacket, warm enough that the sun still carried a little summer in it. By then, the flower field had become almost as popular as the vegetable garden. Every Saturday, families wandered between rows of zinnias and sunflowers carrying little scissors and woven baskets. Children argued over which flower was prettiest. Grandparents pointed out varieties they remembered from their own childhood. Sometimes I'd stop working for a minute just to listen. Not because anyone was talking about me, because they were talking to each other. That had always been Grandpa's goal. The garden wasn't supposed to impress people. It was supposed to bring them together. One Tuesday afternoon, while I was updating inventory in the office, Daniel walked in holding his tablet. "You might want to see this." I looked up. "What happened?" He handed me the screen. It was another one of Madison's videos. Only this time, she wasn't just visiting the property. She was calling it our family farm. She talked about our vision, our flower business, our educational program. She even said, "I've always loved gardening." I watched the entire 3-minute video without saying a word. When it ended, I quietly handed the tablet back. Daniel frowned. "That's not true." "I know. You should say something." I shook my head. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because people eventually notice the difference between someone who builds something and someone who photographs it." I wasn't trying to be clever. I genuinely believed that. Truth usually takes longer than a lie, but it tends to arrive with better evidence. The following weekend, something happened that made me realize other people had started noticing too. A volunteer named Carol pulled me aside while we were unloading pumpkins. Carol was in her late 60s, retired elementary school teacher. She never missed a Saturday. She lowered her voice. "I hope you don't mind me asking something." "Of course." "Does your sister actually work here?" I smiled. "Why?" "I've seen her online talking like she does." Then Carol glanced toward the greenhouse. "I've been volunteering here every weekend for 8 months. I've never seen her hold a shovel." I laughed softly. "No, you haven't." Carol nodded once. "I figured." Then she picked up another pumpkin and went back to work. That conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. But it stayed with me all day. People weren't as easily fooled as Madison seemed to think. Around the same time, the first signs of trouble started appearing in Madison's career. Not publicly. Privately. Mom mentioned it during a phone call. Madison's agency lost 2 big clients. "I'm sorry to hear that. They're restructuring." "I hope everything works out." "It will." Mom answered quickly. "She's talented." "I know she is." And I meant it. Madison really was talented. She knew how to present herself. She understood cameras. She worked hard. None of that had ever bothered me. What bothered me was how easily she dismissed everyone else's work. 2 weeks later, Dad stopped by after lunch. He found me repairing one of the irrigation valves. He stood there for a minute before speaking. "Your mother's worried." "About Madison?" He nodded. "Modeling isn't as steady as it used to be." I tightened another fitting. "I imagine that's stressful." Dad looked toward the flower field. "You know, I've been thinking." I waited. "Your grandfather always said a person should learn at least one skill nobody can take away." I smiled. "He did say that." Dad sighed. "I don't think Madison ever listened." The annual Harvest Festival was only 3 weeks away. It was our biggest event of the year. More than 1,000 visitors were expected. Local musicians, food trucks, school groups, pumpkin carving, hayrides, flower arranging workshops. Daniel and I had spreadsheets covering nearly every surface in our office. Volunteer schedules, parking maps, emergency contacts, supply lists. It wasn't glamorous, but organized events never are behind the scenes. Then my phone rang. Madison. I answered. Hey. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. So, I've been thinking.
About what?
The Harvest Festival. I waited. I've got an idea. She explained that several lifestyle brands she'd worked with were looking for authentic countryside content. She wanted to film promotional material during the festival. She talked for almost 10 minutes. Brand partnerships, cross-promotion, media exposure, content strategy. Finally, I asked, so, what exactly are you asking? She paused. I'd like exclusive access before visitors arrive. Exclusive. Just for a couple of hours. So nobody else is in the background. I looked at the calendar. That morning volunteers would be unloading produce. Schools would already be arriving. Vendors would be setting up. I'm sorry, we really can't close the property. Her tone changed almost immediately. It would help both of us. It would mostly help your sponsors. Silence. Then she laughed. You've become surprisingly business-minded.
No.
I've become responsible for other people's time. She ended the call a few minutes later. The conversation felt polite, but colder than usual. Harvest Festival morning arrived with clear blue skies. By 7 o'clock, the parking field was already filling. Volunteers wore matching green shirts. Children ran toward the pumpkin patch. A local bluegrass band tuned their instruments near the barn. The entire property buzzed with the kind of happy chaos you can't really manufacture. Around 9:30, I noticed a familiar white SUV. Madison had come anyway, this time with 2 photographers, a videographer, and what looked like a makeup artist. Nobody had mentioned any of this beforehand. I walked over before they unpacked equipment. Morning. Hey. She smiled brightly. We'll stay out of everyone's way. One photographer was already setting up lights. I looked around. Families were waiting to enter the flower field. School buses were unloading. The timing couldn't have been worse. I'm sorry. We really don't have space for a commercial shoot today. It's not commercial. It is. She hesitated. It's promotional. For paid sponsors? Yes. I kept my voice calm. Then today isn't the right day. Her smile disappeared. So, you're seriously telling me to leave? I'm asking you to respect the event. She crossed her arms. This is unbelievable. Before I could answer, Dad walked over. He looked from me to Madison, to the camera equipment. Then he quietly asked, Did Emily approve this? Madison didn't answer. Dad nodded once. Then pack it up. For a second, nobody moved. Finally, the photographers started folding light stands. Madison looked at Dad like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. You've got to be kidding. Dad met her eyes.
No.
You don't show up after months away and make today about yourself. It was the first time I'd ever seen him stand up to her. Not loudly, just firmly. Madison turned around without another word and walked back toward the SUV. Mom, who had been sitting inside the passenger seat the entire time, never got out. As the vehicle pulled away, Daniel quietly joined me. You okay? I nodded. I think something just changed. What? My dad. For the first time in years, he hadn't protected the person causing the problem. He'd protected the person doing the work. And whether he realized it or not, that mattered. A lot. That evening, after the festival ended, we counted attendance. 1,312 visitors. More than we'd ever had. The food pantry received nearly 2,000 pounds of donated produce. Children carried home hundreds of seedlings they'd planted themselves. The greenhouse lights stayed on long after sunset while volunteers finished cleaning. I stood outside for a moment looking across Grandpa's property. The same land Madison once called just dirt. The same place she'd refused to help restore. It had become something none of us imagined. Not because one person built it, because dozens of people believed it was worth protecting. I smiled to myself. Some gardens grow vegetables. Some grow communities. And sometimes, without anyone noticing, they also reveal people's true character. What I didn't know was that before winter arrived, Madison's carefully built public image would begin collapsing. And when it did, she wouldn't call her agency. She wouldn't call her sponsors. She would call me, because the sister who once laughed at dirt under my fingernails was about to discover that some things can't be fixed with perfect lighting. Winter has a way of slowing everything down. The flower fields turned brown. The vegetable beds rested beneath layers of straw. The orchard stood quiet against gray Kentucky skies. Visitors became fewer, but the work never stopped. People often imagine gardens are only busy in the spring and summer. They aren't. Winter is when you repair everything nobody notices. Broken gates, bent irrigation lines, accounting, planning, ordering seeds, reviewing what worked and what didn't. It was my favorite season. There were no cameras, no crowds, just work. By December, Daniel and I had transformed one corner of Grandpa's old equipment shed into a small office. Nothing expensive. A wooden desk from a local auction, 2 filing cabinets, a whiteboard, shelves full of seed catalogs, and Grandpa's notebook sitting exactly in the middle of my desk. Every Monday morning I'd make coffee, open that notebook, and compare his planting schedules with mine. Some years were different. Weather changes, rainfall changes. But his notes reminded me that patience rarely goes out of style. The Harvest Festival had generated more income than we expected, not because we raised prices,
Because more people came.
After paying every expense, Daniel and I sat down one Friday evening with our accountant. She slid a folder across the table. You have a decision to make. What kind? You can continue operating exactly as you are. Or, she smiled, you can officially establish this as a non-profit educational foundation. Daniel looked at me. What do you think? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked through the window toward Grandpa's greenhouse. Then I smiled. I think he'd like that. 3 months later, the Walter Carter Community Garden Foundation officially became a registered nonprofit. Everything remained simple. School education, food donations, gardening classes, community volunteers. The only difference was that grants now became available. By spring, we received enough funding to build wheelchair-accessible garden beds. Then a local hardware company donated tools. A landscaping supplier donated mulch. A retired architect volunteered to redesign walking paths. Every month, someone new wanted to help. Not because they expected anything back, because they believed in the mission. Grandpa would have called that a good harvest. Madison rarely appeared anymore. But I noticed something changing online. She posted less often. Brand partnerships disappeared. Professional photo shoots became infrequent. The glamorous travel slowed. Instead, there were motivational quotes, old modeling pictures, reposted memories. Nothing unusual by itself. But, together, it suggested someone trying to stay visible. One afternoon, Mom called. Her voice sounded unusually tired. Emily, can we talk? Of course. She hesitated. Madison's agency closed. I'm sorry. It happened quickly. Several seconds passed. They lost investors. Most of their contracts disappeared. I'm really sorry to hear that. I know you two haven't always. She stopped herself. Seen eye to eye. I quietly answered. I never wanted anything bad to happen to her. And I meant it. Success isn't a competition. At least, it never was for me. A week later, Dad drove out to the property by himself. He helped Daniel replace fence boards for nearly 2 hours before speaking. She isn't taking it well. I knew who he meant. Has she found other work? He shook his head. She's trying. We continued working. Finally, he added, I think she believed modeling would always be there. I looked toward the orchard. Most people think good seasons last forever. They don't. Neither of us said anything after that. The sound of hammers filled the afternoon. Spring returned, along with thousands of tiny green seedlings. Life started again. School tours resumed. Volunteers returned. The greenhouse filled with laughter. Everything felt hopeful. Until the phone rang one Tuesday morning. Madison. For the first time in almost 6 months. I answered. Hi. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. Less certain. Emily. I need to ask you something. I waited. Can we meet? Sure. What about? I'd rather explain in person. We agreed to meet Saturday afternoon after the last workshop. She arrived exactly on time. No designer SUV. No photographer. No makeup artist. Just an older silver Honda she'd apparently borrowed. She wore jeans, sneakers, a plain sweatshirt. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. We sat on the porch overlooking Grandpa's garden. The same porch where he'd shell peas every summer evening. For nearly a minute neither of us spoke. Finally, she sighed. My career isn't going the way I thought. I nodded. I heard. I've been interviewing. No luck. I'm sorry. She looked at the greenhouse. This place. It's incredible. Thank you. Another silence. Then she finally asked. I was wondering if maybe you could create a position for me here. The words hung between us. Not dramatic. Just unexpected. I asked carefully. What kind of position? She smiled weakly. Marketing. Public relations. Social media. I know I could help. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked one question. Madison, have you ever wanted to work here? She looked confused. What do you mean? I mean before today. Before the agency closed. Before sponsorships disappeared. Before interviews stopped. Did you ever want to work here? She stared toward the flower field.
No.
Why now? She swallowed. Because I need a fresh start. I believed her. At least partly. But believing someone and ignoring history aren't the same thing. I stood up. Come with me. We walked slowly toward the greenhouse. Inside, volunteers were teaching 6 children how to transplant lettuce seedlings. Nobody recognized Madison. Nobody asked for selfies. Nobody cared who she'd once modeled for. The children only cared whether their tiny plants would survive. I watched them for a minute, then quietly said, "This is what we actually do." She nodded. I know.
No.
I don't think you do. We continued walking. Past compost piles. Storage sheds. Raised beds. Tool racks. Donation shelves. Finally, we reached the equipment barn. I opened the door. Inside were muddy boots. Wheelbarrows. Seed trays. Broken shovel handles waiting for repair. Boxes of gloves. The ordinary things that keep extraordinary places alive. I turned toward her. This place isn't built on attention. It's built on people showing up. She looked down at the floor. I know I wasn't here.
No.
You weren't. Another long silence settled between us. Then she quietly asked, So, is that a no? I looked at my sister. Really looked. For the first time in years. She wasn't standing in designer boots anymore. She wasn't posing for cameras. She was simply a woman who'd built her identity around something that disappeared faster than she'd imagined. I felt sympathy. But sympathy isn't the same as trust. I can't hire you. Her eyes immediately filled. I continued before she could speak. Not because you failed. Because everyone working here started by volunteering. They earn responsibility by showing up. I can't ask them to skip that process. She stared at me for several seconds, then quietly whispered, I understand. I wasn't sure she actually did, but she nodded anyway. Before leaving, she turned around one last time. What if I volunteer? I smiled. The gate's always been open. She looked toward the garden, then back at me. I'll think about it. She drove away. Daniel walked over a minute later. How'd it go? I watched the silver Honda disappear down the gravel road. I honestly don't know. What do you mean? I think today was the first honest conversation we've had in years. He nodded. Sometimes that's where rebuilding starts. Maybe. Or maybe it was simply another crossroads. Because what neither of us knew was that someone else had already been paying attention to everything happening at Grandpa's garden. And within a month, a single newspaper article would completely change the way our entire town saw my sister.
And me.
Any month later, the article appeared on a quiet Thursday morning. I almost missed it. One of our volunteers, Carol, walked into the greenhouse carrying a folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm. She smiled before placing it on the potting bench. "I think you'll want to keep this one." I looked down. The headline covered nearly half the front page of the local section. "One grandfather's garden becomes a community legacy." Beneath the title was a photograph I didn't even remember being taken. Not of me standing with flowers. Not of me giving interviews. It showed me kneeling beside 3 elementary school students as we transplanted lettuce seedlings into one of the raised beds. All of us had dirt on our hands. None of us seemed to notice. I unfolded the newspaper carefully. The reporter had spent almost 2 months interviewing volunteers, teachers, local businesses, and families who had visited the property. She'd spoken with the director of the food pantry, the retired carpenter who built the children's planting tables, parents whose children attended our workshops, even neighbors who remembered Grandpa Walter from decades earlier. What surprised me most was what she didn't write. She never called me extraordinary. She never described me as a hero. Instead, she wrote something much simpler. Emily Carter didn't create the garden alone. She simply became the first person willing to keep showing up after everyone else stopped. I read that sentence 3 times. Daniel leaned over my shoulder. "That's probably the most accurate thing anyone's written." I smiled. I think Grandpa would have approved. The article spread faster than I expected. By the weekend, people from neighboring counties were stopping by just to say they'd read about the foundation. Some brought donations. Others volunteered. A retired teacher offered to organize children's reading days in the greenhouse. A local nursery donated hundreds of seed packets. The newspaper had accomplished something no advertisement ever could. It told the truth. Saturday afternoon, while we were closing the gift shed, Carol walked over carrying her phone. "You should probably see this." She handed it to me. The article had been shared online thousands of times. Most of the comments talked about the volunteers, the children,
Grandpa.
the food pantry. But another conversation had quietly started underneath. Someone had posted one of Madison's old promotional videos beside the newspaper article. People began asking simple questions. "I thought she said this was her project?" "The article says volunteers have never seen her." "Didn't she claim she helped build all this?" There were no insults. No cruel jokes. Just questions. Honest questions. And honest questions have a way of making dishonest stories very uncomfortable. I handed Carol's phone back. "I don't want anyone arguing." Carol nodded. "I know. But you didn't start this."
No.
I didn't. Later that evening, my phone rang.
Mom.
I answered. "Hi, Mom." She didn't speak immediately. Finally, she asked, "Have you seen what's happening online?" "I've seen some comments. They're being unfair to Madison." I looked across the empty garden. The volunteers had gone home. The greenhouse lights glowed softly against the evening sky. "I don't think people are being unfair. They're confused." Mom sighed. "She's devastated." "I'm sorry. You could tell everyone she helped." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Mom, did she?" Silence. Long enough that I already knew the answer. Finally, she whispered, "No, I didn't say anything."
Neither did she.
Sometimes silence tells the truth before words are ready to. 2 days later, another visitor arrived. Only this time, it wasn't a reporter. It was Dad. He found me repairing one of the greenhouse doors before speaking. "I owe you an apology." I looked up. "For what?" "For a lot of years." He rested both hands on the workbench. "When your grandfather left you this land, I thought he'd given you the smaller inheritance." He looked around slowly. Children laughed outside near the raised beds. Volunteers unloaded fresh compost. Someone was playing bluegrass music near the barn. Dad smiled sadly. I couldn't have been more wrong. I set my screwdriver down. You don't have to apologize. Yes, I do. He took a slow breath. I spent years celebrating what people could see. I ignored the work nobody noticed. His voice grew quieter. That's on me. For the first time in my adult life, my father wasn't defending Madison. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't asking me to keep the peace. He was simply telling the truth. And somehow, that meant more than hearing the words, "I'm sorry." The following Saturday, something happened that surprised every volunteer. Just after 8 in the morning, an old silver Honda rolled slowly through the front gate. No photographers, no cameras, no makeup artist, just Madison. She climbed out wearing faded jeans, a sweatshirt, and a pair of inexpensive work boots that still looked almost new. She walked toward me carrying a pair of gardening gloves still attached to their cardboard packaging. For a second, neither of us spoke. Finally, she held up the gloves. I wasn't sure what kind to buy. I smiled. Those will work. She nodded once. So, where do I start? I didn't hand her a camera, or a marketing plan, or an office key. Instead, I pointed toward a wheelbarrow full of compost waiting beside the children's garden. The tomatoes need fresh soil. She looked at the overflowing wheelbarrow, then at me, then quietly rolled up her sleeves. Without another word, she picked up the shovel, and for the first time in her life, she started helping.